When Emily and her friends rented a charming cabin on Airbnb nestled deep in the woods, they were thrilled for a peaceful weekend getaway. The listing described it as a cozy, secluded escape, promising beautiful views, hiking trails, and a perfect break from the city. Upon arrival, the cabin seemed even better than in the pictures, rustic yet comfortable, with the smell of pine filling the air. The first evening was uneventful, spent by the fireplace, laughing and sharing stories. But when night fell, they noticed something odd. Just past the trees, lights flickered from another house nearby. The host had mentioned that the nearest neighbors were miles away, yet here was this shadowy house, barely visible through the dense woods, glowing dimly. Curious and unsettled, they decided to explore a bit the next day. They took a trail toward the house, eager to see who might live there. As they got closer, they noticed several eerie details. The house was slightly tilted, with broken windows crudely covered by tattered curtains. An uneasy silence hung over the property. Just as they were about to leave, the front door creaked open and a woman stepped out. She looked to be in her 60s, with unkempt hair and clothes that looked as though they hadn't been washed in years. Her smile was too wide, almost forced, as she waved at them without a word. Emily's friend Jake tried to start a conversation, asking if she knew their Airbnb host, but the woman simply tilted her head, looking them up and down without answering. Then she raised a finger to her lips in a shh motion, her eyes wide and unblinking. The group quickly excused themselves, hastily returning to their cabin with chills running down their spines. That night, strange noises began to echo from the woods. Emily thought she heard footsteps scraping along the porch outside, followed by a light tapping on the windows. When she peered outside, all she saw was darkness and the faint outline of the other house, now completely dark. She was about to dismiss it as paranoia when she noticed something strange by their front door, a trail of muddy footprints leading up the steps and stopping abruptly at the threshold. The next morning, they found a note pinned to their door. In messy, childlike scrawl, it read, "Hope you're enjoying your stay. We're watching." Disturbed, Emily and her friends decided it was time to call the host, but when they pulled up the Airbnb listing, they realized with horror that the listing had vanished. Their reservation confirmation was still in Emily's email, but the property was no longer searchable. Now, even more unsettled, they resolved to pack up and leave, cutting their trip short. However, as they loaded up the car, they heard the sounds of footsteps approaching through the trees. The woman from the neighboring house emerged, this time with a man, her husband presumably, who looked just as disheveled and hollow-eyed as she did. They stood in the middle of the road, blocking the car's only path out. The man gave a slow wave, and the woman's grin spread even wider, as if daring them to try and leave. In a panic, Emily's friend floored the gas pedal, swerving around the strange couple. As they sped down the dirt road, they saw the woman and man in the rearview mirror, still standing there, watching until they were out of sight. They didn't stop driving until they were miles away, finally pulling into a gas station, hearts pounding. When they tried to report the incident, no one at Airbnb could find any record of the property, nor any host by the name they'd been given. And to make things worse, the address on their confirmation email didn't match any known road in the area. Months later, Emily found a news article by accident. The article was about a series of disappearances in the woods near where they had stayed, the most recent of which had involved a couple who had rented an Airbnb in the area and vanished without a trace. And there, in the article's photograph of the missing persons, was a familiar cabin tucked in the woods, and the eerie silhouette of a figure standing at the window, watching from the dark. It was a quiet, cold autumn night when Mark snuck out of his house, backpack slung over his shoulder, spray cans rattling softly with each step. He had made a bet with his friends, $20 and bragging rights, that he could pull off a graffiti piece on the railway underpass, right in the heart of the guarded zone. He'd scoped out the spot earlier that day. Rusty fences, floodlights casting long shadows, and old rail cars that hadn't moved in years. It was forbidden territory, yes, but the ultimate canvas. He could practically hear his friends' cheers as he imagined his name sprawled in vibrant neon colors for everyone to see. They dared him, and he wasn't about to back down. When he reached the spot, he slipped through a loose section of the fence and crept along the tracks, glancing around to make sure he wasn't seen. The air felt colder here, thick and heavy with an eerie silence that seemed to swallow up every sound he made. He shook off the nerves and picked out his colors, deciding to start with the outline. His spray can hiss to life, and bright paint bloomed across the gritty wall. But then he felt it, a prickling sensation on the back of his neck. He spun around, heart pounding, but saw nothing. Just empty tracks stretching out into the night, rail cars looming like silent ghosts. "Just your nerves, Mark," he muttered to himself and went back to work. As he layered the paint, the prickling sensation returned, stronger this time, like invisible eyes pressing down on him. He turned again, and this time he swore he saw something, a shadow darting behind one of the rail cars. He called out, "Hello?" His voice thin against the oppressive quiet. No response. He tried to shrug it off, but his hands were starting to shake. He finished the outline quickly, breathing fast, telling himself it was just the rush of getting caught. He was almost done when he heard a faint scraping sound, like metal dragging across concrete. His heart leapt into his throat. He turned toward the noise, squinting into the dark. There, between the cars, he saw it. A figure, tall and gaunt, standing just at the edge of the floodlight's glow. It was too dark to make out any details, but he could tell it was watching him, not moving, just watching. Mark's breath came in shallow gasps. He took a step back, clutching his spray can like it could protect him. The figure shifted slowly, with an unnatural jerking motion. Mark turned and ran, sneakers pounding against the gravel, heartbeat thundering in his ears. He didn't dare look back. He just kept running, following the fence line, hoping he could find the spot where he had slipped through. But the fence seemed to stretch on endlessly, the hole he'd entered through nowhere in sight. Panic clawed at him. He turned a corner and froze. There, painted on the wall in giant dripping letters, was his name. But he hadn't painted it. Mark. The letters seemed to pulse, wet and dark, as if written in something thicker than paint. He backed away, chest tight with terror, and stumbled over a loose rock. As he fell, he caught a final glimpse of the figure stepping into the light, its long, skeletal hand stretching out toward him. The next morning, Mark's friends met at the railway, expecting to find him waiting to brag about his masterpiece. They found his graffiti, all right, a messy, frantic scrawl of his name, splattered across the wall as if he'd written it in a panic. But there was something else, too. Around his name were smears of dark red trailing down the wall like thick, dripping paint. Mark was never seen again. His friends searched, police were called, but no trace of him was ever found. All that remained was his name, painted in a shade too dark, too deep, and when they looked closer, they swore they saw marks on the wall, scratches, like fingernails clawing at the concrete, desperately trying to escape. Emma worked long shifts at the little cafe in town, where regulars shuffled in and out, leaving crumbs and gossip behind. Tonight had been particularly exhausting, and the sky was pitch black by the time her shift ended. She hated walking alone through the cornfield, especially after dark. But it was the quickest way home, and she was too tired to take the long route around. She slung her bag over her shoulder and started down the narrow dirt path cutting through the field, ignoring the unease settling in her chest. Halfway through the field, she spotted a scarecrow she'd never seen before, its figure looming against the night sky. It stood just a few feet off the path, its tattered clothes flapping faintly in the breeze. Emma shuddered at the sight of it, its head cocked at an unnatural angle, straw poking out from under a burlap sack that served as its face. 2 dark holes gaped where eyes should have been, and a twisted, frayed grin had been sewn into the sack. She hurried her pace, but the feeling of being watched crept up her spine. When she dared a quick glance back, her blood froze. The scarecrow had shifted. It was closer now, its body angled toward her, head tilted as though it were studying her. Her heart thundered as she stumbled forward, picking up speed. "Just a trick of the shadows," she whispered, trying to calm herself. But her stomach knotted, and her legs pumped faster. When she glanced back again, her throat went dry. The scarecrow was now on the path, its empty black eyes locked onto her. Emma broke into a sprint, her shoes pounding against the packed dirt. But with each glance over her shoulder, she saw it moving closer, its straw arms outstretched, fingers stiff and claw-like, as though eager to grab her. She darted off the path, weaving between the corn stalks, praying that the scarecrow couldn't leave its post. But the footsteps behind her grew louder, heavy and relentless, crunching the dry soil underfoot. A rustling whispered through the corn, accompanied by a low, scraping sound, like something dragging across the earth. Finally, Emma turned to face it, heart pounding so hard it hurt. Grabbing a fallen branch, she swung wildly, striking the scarecrow square in the chest. To her surprise, the scarecrow staggered back, but only for a moment. Then, it lunged forward again, its sewn grin stretching wider, threads tearing to reveal something dark and twisted beneath the sack. "Stay away!" she screamed, slashing again with the branch. She swung harder, landing a blow on its head. The burlap sack split open, and the figure crumpled, collapsing to the ground. She watched, breathless and shaking, as the scarecrow lay still, straw spilling from the hole she'd made in its chest. Emma took a few shaky steps back, relief flooding her. But as she turned to leave, something snapped behind her. She stopped dead in her tracks, glancing back at the twisted figure. The straw inside it began to shift and coil, like tendrils reaching for something. Before she could scream, the scarecrow's hand shot up, gripping her ankle with impossible strength. She stumbled, falling to the ground, as it pulled her closer, its lifeless eyes now gleaming with a new, malicious intent. The threads on its face pulled tighter, the sewn grin widening until it stretched from ear to ear, revealing dark teeth hidden beneath the burlap. Emma kicked and thrashed, but the scarecrow's grip only tightened. She clawed at the dirt, nails breaking as she tried to pull herself away, but it was too strong. With a desperate cry, she reached for the branch and swung again, smashing it down onto the scarecrow's arm. But the blow only seemed to excite it. The scarecrow's fingers sank deeper into her skin, and she watched in horror as its other arm jerked, snapping and twisting back into place. Slowly, it rose from the ground, pulling her closer with each movement, the sound of rustling straw filling her ears. It leaned over her, its torn face hovering inches above hers. She struggled to break free, but she was trapped, its grip iron-like. And as the moonlight slipped through the corn stalks, she saw something horrifying, her own terrified face reflected in its gaping eyes, as though she had become a part of it. With one last burst of strength, Emma tore free and bolted down the path, her screams piercing the quiet night. She didn't dare look back, her only focus on escape. She was certain she could hear its footsteps behind her, slower now but steady, always getting closer. She burst through the edge of the cornfield and ran all the way to her house, slamming the door behind her. Gasping for breath, she peered out the window, half expecting to see it standing there. But the field was empty, the corn swaying gently in the breeze. Just as she began to calm herself, she noticed something on the ground beside her door, a small pile of straw, forming a crude, mocking grin, as if to remind her that the scarecrow was still out there, waiting for her to return.